was published in, I think, 1993 in the New Yorker, and it's a kind of meme, and many people have come across this cartoon or variations of this cartoon, particularly in the consumer space, I guess, but we're going to be focusing on the enterprise corporate space here in terms of managing identities, managing users, managing the life cycle of users. Here are some of the areas just to talk about access, talking about authentication, we're talking about authorization, federating identities between business partners who agree on a partnership, trusting each other, trusting who the identity is, provisioning, that's an important area. Now, SAML doesn't really cover provisioning. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Managing the user lifecycle management, resetting passwords, that kind of thing. And just generally governance, risk and compliance, and security in general. So in a sense, today we'll just be talking about the first two, maybe touching on the others as well. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of words on that one, sorry, but the SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. It's an XML-based open standard that was derived or ratified by OASIS for exchanging authentication and authorization data, in particularly the syntax and semantics of exchanging that data, between two or more parties, in particular an identity provider and a service provider. I'll define those a little bit as well. And that particularly one of the key use cases to enable web-based, browser-based, multi-domain, cross-domain or cross-domain boundaries, single sign-on. So we'll go into a little bit more detail about all these areas. As I mentioned, there's a lot of abbreviations. You're probably aware of some of these, but I'll just quickly whiz through them. IDP, I'll use the word IDP for meaning identity provider, SP for service provider, and typically there's multiple applications that you'll be connecting to, so there's multiple service providers, and you're using the identity provider as a sort of source of truth for user identities. There's a concept of circle of trust, which is not actually, I don't believe is actually in the standard. It does talk about trust relationships, but it's a concept that came from an orthogonal standard process that fed into SAML. We'll talk about setting up a circle of trust. PKI, public key infrastructure, that's a basis for SAML, and then the SAML itself, and single sign-on, SSO, and I've added single logout, which I'll call SLO for short, so single sign-on, single logout, where appropriate. And I've put in HTTPS, you're aware of HTTP over SSL. I believe SAML standard doesn't actually mandate that you use SSL, but it's highly recommended, and for the purpose of using Alfresco, you'd be using the message you'd be passing over SSL. So I think I already mentioned one of the key arguably the key use case for at least using SAML in its simplest form is single sign-on and optionally single logout, a global logout. So you, as a user, SAML involves a number of parties, particularly we've mentioned identity provider, service provider, but actually in most cases it also involves a user, a subject, a principal, so typically using a client that's browser-based or otherwise. And so you, as a user, you would log into one or more applications. In this case, you'd use Alfresco, put your content to work, and at some point, hopefully, if you're using logout, you'd log out or your sessions were timeout, and then you would log out from all of your apps, so you can access one or more applications. A variation of that is what some people call deep linking, but effectively you may be sent a link via email, or maybe you've bookmarked a link. An example would be if you're using Share, you might have a link to a piece of content, a folder, maybe a site document library, and if you access that link, if you haven't already SSO'd or single signed on, then that's effectively a protected resource from the service provider, in this case Alfresco resource, so you would be sent to the identity provider to authenticate yourself, and I'll show the flow soon. And then it kind of follows above. You'd log in and then have access to that resource and to that application and other applications as well. So this is sort of diagrammatic form of that. There's kind of two, in terms of SAML, there's kind of two examples. There's what's called IDP-initiated single sign-on. And really, as a user, you might go to some kind of corporate portal where you have a number of applications. So you sign on to that portal once, and you might use a password typically, or you might have multi-factor authentication. And then when you want to access an application or a resource at Alfresco or other applications, you effectively click through. Now, the identity provider, these are across trust boundaries, effectively across the internet if you're using cloud applications. So the IDP, identity provider, will be trusted by the service provider, in this case Alfresco. And on the left-hand side, when you log in, effectively the ID provider just sends what's called a SAML assertion, which is XML, encoded XML with a digital signature that says, this is the user ID, and we will say the user authenticated this time, maybe using a certain mechanism like password. But because of the trust relationship that we're going to be talking about in a moment, the service provider just lets that user in. So all that happens is the message gets sent and you're in, based on that single sign-on session. The DS is a directory server. Typically, if that was behind your firewall on a corporate network, it'd be enterprise directory server, maybe LDAP-based Active Directory, ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services. That has your users and passwords. The password is not sent across that message. I put on LI. LI is effectively local identities. Typically, applications will have to maintain their own local identities. And I mentioned earlier in a slide, this is where effectively the federation of identities comes into play. On the right-hand side, it's a slight variation of that, which is what's called service provider-initiated single sign-on. But it's the example I gave earlier with the link. Or you might access either a link in Alfresco, a piece of content, or you might just go to effectively an entry point, a pseudo login page for Alfresco in the cloud. And if you're not yet authenticated, if you don't have a single sign-on session, Alfresco, the service provider, in this case Alfresco, will redirect you to the identity provider by sending an authentication request. The authentication request, if you're already signed on at the identity provider, will come straight back and you'll just be let in. If not, you'll get a typical login box where you type in a password, or again, multi-factor authentication. And then the second part carries on, the SAML assertion will come through, and then Alfresco will let you in. This is an example of the IDP-initiated single sign-on. Now, I don't know if you're aware, at the beginning of the conference, Centrify announced a partnership with Alfresco to support SAML in the cloud with their product. And they've done a little YouTube video that you can find in just a couple of minutes that demonstrates this. I've just taken a couple of screenshots from that YouTube video. And this is an example of Centrify, their portal, where you can see a number of applications. You've already signed into that portal in this example. It's what we call IDP initiated. And you just simply click on the Alfresco logo there, and it's straight into Share Dashboard, into your account, because you've already previously signed on. So who uses and supports SAML? It's a mature standard. It's been around for some time. These are well-known names. You'll know all these names here. These are some of the people that are on the original, well, I think they're on the original technical committee. The SSTC is the Security Services Technical Committee. I think most of these were involved with the definition and ratification of this specification. And there's hundreds of examples. I've just thrown a few up here. Probably lots of people in the industry support SAML. So it's a very well-established standard. Put Alfresco there. Centrify gave an example. Internet 2 is an organization that also has what's called the Shibboleth project. And the Shibboleth project includes the OpenSAML library. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Another example is, I'm just calling a few out that you can see there, ForgeRock. ForgeRock has a product called OpenAM that is effectively a fork, I guess a fork of what used to be called Sun OpenSSO, if you're aware of OpenSSO. Oracle acquired that. I don't believe they're supporting that any further because they have their own identity management software. But ForgeRock have a product called OpenAM that's effectively an evolution of OpenSSO. So in terms of the SAML standard and the spec, just a quick overview. As I mentioned, it's an OASIS standard. There's a history graph there you can look up on the internet, have a look, but it's been around for some time. There were a couple of competing, or I guess orthogonal standards being developed, and they merged into one to form SAML version 2.0. I won't go into too much detail because I'll probably run out of time. So you can have a look at that slide later. But one thing I was mentioning, that the standard is very broad and very flexible and has a lot of options, and that can make it more complicated than it needs to be, particularly if you're just starting out or looking at the single sign-on use case through, for example, a web-based application. So one of the things to do is, obviously, if you're going to look at using OpenSAML, or if you're, is to read the specifications, but there's a lot of documents, I'll mention that in a minute. But there's also a couple of overviews, an executive and a technical overview that I think were written probably a few years later, 2008, I think was the last published version. And they're worth having a read first if you haven't found them. They're not officially part of the specification, but they kind of affect like an addendum to it. So in terms of the anatomy of SAML, it's kind of a layered thing in terms of both the messages, the XML. There's various XML schema, XSDs, XML schema definitions that define the standard. There's a sort of outer layer profiles. The one we're particularly interested in is the web browser single sign-on profile, but also the single logout profile. And I think there's something like 8 profiles, I think I wrote in my notes. But those are the two we're going to particularly talk about here today. There's a number of ways of binding SAML. It's, as I say, a very flexible specification. It's also extensible, which can make it more complex. But we're going to focus on HTTP post. That's the binding that we support, Alfresco as a service provider. And there's a core which has the assertions that I've already briefly mentioned, where the assertion message has, for us, the most important thing is the user ID, but there's other attributes that can be passed in that message. The protocols for sending those messages across. Metadata, which is particularly around configuring SAML, and I'll talk a little bit about the metadata, and some other parts around the authentication context, which would be, for example, that the user authenticated with a password policy or a multi-factor authentication policy. And there's a glossary, which actually I think the glossary is a normative part of the specification. Some conformance documents, and if you probably can't see from the back, but I put a few page numbers on all those documents. There's 66, 46, 86. There's a lot of pages to read there, and if you go through all those documents, there's a little bit of boilerplate on each one, which is why I recommend having a look at the overviews first if you haven't come across SAML before. So, in terms of configuring the SAML, in terms of setting up a trust relationship and then using SAML in production in terms of the flows, the first thing is to set it up. As I say, I don't think it's a standard part of the specification, but what some people would call a circle of trust, or a trust relationship between the identity provider on the left, Alfresco as an example, service provider, one or more service providers on the right. So in terms of the spec, the identity provider is sometimes called the asserting party. It's the person who sends the assertion saying this user had signed on, and Alfresco is or the service provider is the consumer or the relying party. It relies on those assertions. But in particular, in terms of setting up this relationship, this handshake or this circle of trust, the metadata is a standard part of the specification. It used to be done out of band. I think in previous versions of SAML, this wasn't defined. The metadata came part of version 2.0. But the key parts of the metadata in terms of configuration are the certificate from both sides, so a public key certificate or a public key from the service provider, which allows the identity provider to digitally sign the messages, and then using the private key, Alfresco can validate that signature, and vice versa. So the identity provider also has a public, vice versa, sorry, service provider has a public key. So there's an exchange. The other key part is the endpoints or the URLs for, in particular, for the single sign-on, single logout message exchanges. In theory, you could just have a single URL because the messages themselves contain the context. But typically, there's usually a URL for the sort of single sign-on part and some URLs for the single logout. So there's one or two URLs to configure. It can be configured manually, but the metadata kind of defines from both the two parties can define their requirements via that metadata. I added in for the service provider, there's an additional piece where, in the case of the current Alfresco implementation, we retrieve the subject or the user ID from an attribute. In this case, there's a couple of ways of doing it. We do it from an attribute, and that we define that as part of our metadata. So that has to be set up on the identity provider side. It's one attribute, just the email address, and that acts as the federated identifier. So it's a global ID. Not all cases of SAML you don't need to use global identifiers. There's various other permutations, but for the purposes of Alfresco in the cloud, we use a global identifier, which is the user's email address, which also allows us to map them onto a network, into an organization or tenant. Some example identity providers. There's a selection there. I mentioned Centrify already, Ping, which I think Ping was demonstrated in the ZASI demonstration. ForgeRock I mentioned in terms of OpenAM, which is based on OpenSSO. Okta, SurfNet, which I think is a Dutch academic network that provides single sign-on services for Dutch academic institutions, and Shibboleth project, which I think is a sort of worldwide, used worldwide by academia to integrate identities around students, researchers, etc. And the Shibboleth project is the one that includes OpenSAML as a library that they provide. So in terms of Alfresco, and in the past I've worked on multi-tenancy for Alfresco. For our cloud services, we're not just dealing with two parties, we're actually dealing with any number of networks. We still have a freemium model, so we have free networks, but in particular for SAML, we only enable that for enterprise networks. So in terms of all the thousands and tens of thousands of networks that we have, there may be certain networks that want to configure SAML. In the example here, I've given network one, a company organization, network one, has set up a circle of trust with their identity provider, either it could be on-premise or it may be in the cloud, and it connects into their corporate directory. In this case, it's using Centrify. Another example, N3, network 3 is using Ping, and they have set up a circle of trust there. And similarly for network 5 using ForgeRock OpenAM. And I just mentioned in the slide there, cloud directory, we maintain a local identity in terms of the back end of Alfresco. So in terms of this, I've showed the circle of trust, which is the configuration, the setup of SAML. When you're actually running in production, here are the flows. There's a lot to read here, so you can always have a look later. There's this diagram, you can find it in other forms. Most providers provide a variation of this diagram. This is my variation, but they're all very similar. They kind of describe a little bit more detail the flow I showed earlier. So I'll go through it quite quickly. If I go too quickly, let me know, but otherwise we can come back to it later if you find me or I need to ask a question. But the user, typically an end user, will be using a browser client, for example, will request a service provider protected resource, a URL to a piece of content or a folder or a document library site. The service provider, if there isn't already a session, will generate a SAML authentication request, sign it, post it to the identity provider. We're using HTTP post binding across HTTPS, send it to this, it will effectively get redirected via the client through either browser agent back to the identity provider. It will know whether that user has already signed on or not. If they haven't, already have a single sign-on session, number 5 there, they will parse the authentication request and validate the signature, then map the user. Well, in this case, the user is not yet known. The user hasn't provided any user ID yet. So there's a request to authenticate in this case. So in this case, it will actually send, for example, pop up a login dialog, which would be typically based on the identity provider. The user to enter their username and a password or any other security credentials, pass back to the identity provider, which will generate the SAML assertion, or what you might call the authentication response. And that authentication response is digitally signed and also encoded, sent back to the SSO URL, what most people would call I guess it has another name, which is you're consuming the assertion, and you've got to parse and validate it at the service provider end. So it's also known as the ACS, the Assertion Consumer Service. But that's the single sign-on URL that accepts that assertion, that authentication response. And if it's valid and it can match the user in terms of federated ID, you'll be logged in. And this kind of happens transparently to the user. You might just go, well, a flicker, but effectively, you already, once you've signed on, then you can access other applications using this flow. And this is a similar flow, slightly more complex, but this is the similar analogous flow for single logout. The single logout is effectively near simultaneous. If a user has initiated a logout, in this case, the example is service provider initiated. You were, for example, in Share on the cloud, and you select to log out as a user. Your request goes to the service provider, would generate a logout request. Again, digitally sign the request, send it to the identity provider. It will verify, it will effectively parse and verify that logout request. And in this case, if it sees that the user is using other service provider, other applications, it will then go back to multiple other service providers in that chain and also send out a logout request to them. They will respond with a logout response. And then finally, there'll be a final logout response to the originating application. If you're not using other applications, it just happens, you skip out the middle part. Obviously, things can go wrong, so single logout is not always guaranteed. It's kind of called a global logout. So in most cases, the authentications are based on sessions, and they typically have a session timeout. It's a little bit like if you just walk away from your browser or walk away from your application. But if everything's hooked up correctly, this flow works reasonably well if the user chooses to explicitly log out. So in terms of using OpenSAML, OpenSAML is an open source library. It's both in Java implementation and C++ implementation. It's a low-level toolkit. We're using the Java version of the toolkit. And as a toolkit, it provides support, and you'll see that in a moment, around generating or producing and consuming SAML messages. And the messages are quite complex. You could do it yourself, you could build it yourself, but actually this provides a nice toolkit that's already available. It can help to create and validate the digital signatures in those messages, and it can also help with generating and parsing the SAML metadata if you're interested in terms of setting up configuration. I've put a little logo there just to remind us that it's produced under the umbrella of the Shibboleth project. And I did put a warning there, and I've put some references at the end of the presentation. Is you should probably, obviously if you're going to use OpenSAML, you'll be reading about it anyway if you haven't already. I don't know, has anybody here used OpenSAML as a library? Okay, a couple of people. You should probably read the FAQs and as well as read about the library in particular, but how did I put it there? I think what they state is effectively it's a low-level library toolkit. It does not provide a complete identity provider or service provider test interface or anything, and it's also not a library that you use to learn about SAML. You really need to know about SAML beforehand. It's not, obviously you can use it as part of if you are learning about SAML, you can use this, but you really need to read the specification and the standards first. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're going to do that, you might want to start with the overviews, or at least part of the overviews, and then drop into the standards, and then have a look at OpenSAML as a library. So if you were going to try out using OpenSAML, if you haven't already, you might want to use it at both sides. So you might have some kind of test IdP, identity provider, that you wrap around that OpenSAML library. Similarly, on the service provider side, you could even have multiple service providers, or in the case of Alfresco Cloud, we have multiple identity providers. I showed that kind of matrix. You might start, for example, you could hard code the configuration, or you might, just to get into the library, I'm not going to show code today, it's very hard to see on the screen anyway, but what you might do is you might, before you start looking at the actual single sign-on flows, you could, as an example, just try out using the metadata generation. So generate on one side, the top, and generate some service provider metadata, consume it at the other side. So in this case, you'd be generating the public key certificate, the URLs. In the case of Alfresco, we also add in attributes, such as the email attribute. And equally, you could generate the identity provider version of the metadata and consume it on the right-hand side. I've put down you would want to either debug it in your IDE or turn on low-level debugging so you can see the message flows. Because the trouble with these kind of integrations, this is an integration between one or two or more systems. When things go wrong, you don't necessarily get any kind of obvious errors or warnings about exactly, it's a security integration. They're usually not very helpful. So you kind of you will need to troubleshoot and debug issues if you're starting from scratch. So you might start this way. Here's an example of the metadata. This is some XML. You can find this all in the standard. And that's just what I think I mentioned earlier. I've just highlighted. You can't see it from the back, apologies, but you can go and find it in the slides later. The public key certificate from, I think this example is our service provider metadata. The single sign-on, single logout URLs, the endpoints that you're configuring, and other information such as the attributes. In this case, we require the email attribute to be set. If you've got past the point, you've either used that to exchange metadata or you've hardwired the configuration in terms of a test setup, then the next stage will be to do the actual request responses for either single sign-on, which would be the most likely place you're going to start, potentially also if you get more complex than single logout. And one way of starting is to start at the identity provider side, and we do what we termed earlier the IDP-initiated login. You just want to generate the assertion from the identity provider and then send it to the service provider and let you in, so that if you signed on the left-hand side, you'll be able to access the application on the right-hand side. So you might just send the assertion across. As you build up, you do the more complex flow, which is to send an authentication request first, and then send the authentication response, which is the assertion. Again, you will need to debug that as you go along, or troubleshoot that along if you're having trouble getting that to work. There are, I think, a few tutorials. If you search for those on the internet, I'm not sure how easy they are to use. They may help, they may not help. You probably have to get down into nuts and bolts if you're really interested in doing this, if you haven't already. Here's an example of, we're using HTTP post binding that I mentioned earlier. When we send a message across, it's encoded in terms of base 64 for the post, and there's effectively an encoded form, I guess. It's a bunch of name value pairs. You can't see them at the back, sorry, but there's examples like key info is a name, signing algorithm and signature. But in particular, there's a SAML request. There's a name equals a base 64 encoded message, a base 64 encoded message of the XML message. Another example on the right, that's the authentication request. In terms of the assertion, the authentication response, the assertion is the name value pair there is SAML response. There are others that I haven't put into the slides, like relay state, which are in the standards around being able to say where you want to end up. In some cases that's used. We make use of it in some cases, not others, but I won't go into details of relay state, but if anybody's interested, we can talk about that later. So there are other name value pairs, but the XML message, which is in that response, here they are decoded. The authentication request on the left, the assertion on the right, which is obviously the key area is the assertion, really. That's what is in the title. But as an example, there's the digital signatures. So it effectively signs the message so that it can't be tampered with. And as I mentioned, in any case, the channel is encrypted because you're using SSL. But the digital signing allows you to effectively have that PKI, that public key infrastructure, that trust relationship. And on the right-hand side, there's the example of the assertion, which is also digitally signed. You can actually sign it twice. You can actually sign the embedded part of the assertion. In there's also the attribute that we're interested in, which is the email address. The subject can be passed a couple of ways. One of the standard ways is what's called a name ID, but also it can be done through an attribute. And there's also another thing called a session index, which normally you wouldn't need, but it proves when you're using certain identity providers, they require it as part of the logout flow. So normally you mostly work, in a simple test example, you'd be interested in that user ID, which is hidden away somewhere on the right there, and that I think is in the bottom circle in terms of the assertion. So these messages are being passed. I'll skip over this slightly, but this is equivalent messages for single logout. There'll be a logout request and a logout response that I mentioned. Obviously, if anybody's interested, we can come back to these later. So the next stage, what you might do is instead of using OpenSAML on both sides, you might want to use actually a real identity provider on one of the sides. You can obviously, if you have access to Centrify or Ping or whatever, you could use those. Or in this example, we're using ForgeRock as just an example. OpenAM, as I mentioned, is a product that's evolved from OpenSSO. And using OpenAM, I think the current community is a community version, it's something like 10.0.0. One of the things I did when I prepared for the slides, we did the integration a little earlier in the year. I just want to make sure I was up and running, make sure I was up to date with what we've been doing. I tried it, and recently what happened with the JDKs, both JDK 6 and JDK 7, is they made some patches, minor releases of the JDK that actually impacted the OpenAM server. So there is a JIRA. I've put a JIRA in there on the ForgeRock website that you can find more details. They have fixed it in their enterprise release. They've also provided a patch, so you can, if you're confident doing that, you could patch the OpenAM community server, or you can downgrade your VM, your JDK just slightly, a couple of revisions for the purpose of testing as a sort of a workaround. But that's a kind of a gotcha that I hit, and again, you get strange error messages. You've got to troubleshoot. There's an example of debugging a security integration of this nature. But if anybody wants to try out OpenSAML against OpenAM, either in the context of Alfresco or using other applications, then that's a little tip for you to find that JIRA. So we talked about the OpenSAML library. In terms of the Alfresco implementation, it's single sign-on, but not as we know it. If people have used Alfresco for some time, there's lots of documentation, I think, wikis and probably our own Alfresco documentation, other tutorials about setting up single sign-on in an enterprise environment using typically what's called a trusted header. It's effectively a header on the HTTP request that literally is the user ID. It's just there. And in order to make that work through share in Alfresco, what you do is you set up that SSO. This is not SAML-based. This is using effectively, it's a non-trusted setup. It's not a circle of trust, but you set up that trusted environment, your enterprise environment. You're not talking out to cloud applications. And you can put the repository into what's called external authentication mode, and it will then allow you to pass that header through. That header has the user ID in it, so you can then, if you have access to those back-end APIs, you could just pass any header. You could be, instead of being John Smith, you could be Fred Blogs, or you could even be an admin. So you do have to make sure that your enterprise environment, if you're using SSOs, is a trusted environment. But in any case, for Alfresco in the cloud, we also need to be multi-tenant across multiple networks, as I mentioned in a diagram earlier. And we enable SAML on a per-network basis for those enterprise customers. Well, actually, it's delegated to those customers, and you'll see. But those customers can self-enable SAML themselves. And because it's multi-tenant, we need to track all those IdP, all those circles of trust in terms of the certificates, the URL, the endpoints, etc. So we couldn't really hook into the authentication mechanism for that reason. So in the case of the way we've done SAML is we use share as a proxy. It passes the SAML messages to the repository, to the back end. So those SAML messages I showed earlier that were base64 encoded and digitally signed, we don't have the OpenSAML in the share layer. We have it in the repository layer. So share acts as a proxy on that flow, and I'll show you a diagram in a minute, for passing through. And what we've done on the back end, we've exposed a new API, a new endpoint, which is the trusted endpoint, and it's relying on SAML as the mechanism of setting up that trust relationship, validating those certificates that were exchanged during the configuration stage. So instead of having a simple sort of plain user ID, it's that whole message, that whole assertion that we've been talking about to allow us to just, when we showed I think it was the IdP-initiated single sign-on, you effectively just let you in. If you send that assertion, it will get parsed, decoded, parsed, digitally validated, and then the user ID be extracted, and if it matches, then you'll be let in. Yeah, I just mentioned there you can extract the user IDs using what's sometimes called the subject or the principal, and we rely, in the case of Alfresco in the cloud, we rely on the email address. Here's a quick screenshot. If people haven't come across this, this is what you would see if you were logging into my.alfresco.com and you're using an enterprise network. There's an admin screen in share that you can then, actually it appears, if you disable the SAML, it appears slightly blank, it just is disabled. If you click on enable, you can then configure your SAML connection first. You probably can't see it in the back, but the key things here really is there's a couple of boxes at the top, but really they're just the single sign-on URL that I mentioned earlier, the single logout URLs if you're using those, and the ability to upload the IdP certificate, which we validate as well during the upload. And if it's not valid or expired, we will provide useful error messages. There's documentation blocks on there. Also at the bottom, we allow you to download the service provider certificate to make that exchange that I showed earlier. So although there's very few settings, and in fact, we didn't quite have time in the project at the time we delivered this, but as a kind of UI optimization or for convenience, we could even skip those 3 boxes at the top by allowing you to directly upload the IdP metadata, and we could extract the URLs for you and put the certificate in for you, just as one, to save you typing in a couple of URLs. And that may be an enhancement we can add later as an option. And some of the identity providers do that on their side. When you configure their side, you can either do it manually and have a lot of options. We've cut it down. We only support one binding. We only support one kind of or 2 profiles. But in this case, it's very, very straightforward to set up. So it's a delegated admin, and if you're having problems, you can test that and then, if necessary, disable that whilst you're trying that out. I'll put a reference at the top. There's a link to the Alfresco documentation at the end of the slides, so you can find that if you're interested. I'm not sure they've got any screenshots, but you can look back at this slide if you're interested. As I mentioned, I'm not really covering user provisioning at all, but just to say what happens if a user does not exist on the service provider end. So the identity provider is managing the user identities and the passwords, and maybe in your corporate directory. In some cases, you might access Alfresco Cloud and you have a new user or a user that's new to Alfresco, but not new in terms of the organization. And so what we can do is what's called just-in-time user provisioning. And in this case, because we have a circle of trust, we trust the assertion. If this is the first time we've seen that user, we can notice that we trust the assertion, we validated the signature, we know what network they're accessing, we know their email address, we'll even do a couple of checks on the email address as well. But basically, for a new user ID, we can pop up a profile page that they can fill in some profile and then activate. So effectively, they get provisioned as a local identity on the Alfresco side just in time, because SAML doesn't really provide that kind of mechanism for managing the actual user lifecycle management that I mentioned earlier. In summary, in terms of diagram, this is just the kind of flow that I've mentioned a couple of times now. The identity provider on the left. In terms of the Alfresco service provider, I've drawn it split. So here I show where share is separate from the repository, and the OpenSAML library is on the right there. And just an example of the flows, and this is where share acts as a proxy. So this isn't the external authentication. So if you search for Alfresco and SSO, you may come across other ways of configuring SSO, but not SAML-based. For the purpose of SAML-based SSO, here's a sort of a quick summary of all the things we've just been talking about. And I'm showing that at the top there, the single sign-on flows, lower down the single logout flows, both whether you're doing service provider initiated or IDP initiated, whether the user's going from a portal or directly going to Alfresco to access a link or whatever. In terms of futures, speculative, these are caveats. I have to, I'm not in product management, I'm in the engineering team, and obviously we're very appreciative of everybody's feedback. So one of the questions I get asked quite a bit is, can we have enterprise, this kind of integration in the enterprise product? Because, or basically effectively on-premise, because people have a corporate directory, they probably, maybe they've invested in an identity provider of their choice, and actually would make it easier to set up single sign-on. As I mentioned, showed you kind of in a sense how easy it is to configure as long as you know kind of a little bit about what you're doing. A lot easier than trying to set up SSO in the kind of non-SAML way. So in theory, yes, when we designed the code for the product, thanks, we've designed it so that it would actually be naturally just slot into enterprise. So it's really a matter of repurposing the code. It kind of sits in effectively what we have a private area for some of the cloud extensions, and effectively that code would effectively literally be moved to the enterprise modules, which would allow it to be part of enterprise. There are a few other things we probably have to tweak. Obviously, in terms of enterprise, we don't rely just on an email address, so we'd have to make that configurable. It's not a refactor or anything. It is kind of a repurpose, but we'd have to test it on the enterprise stacks. If you're interested in that, please contact us. Please talk to product management. I think they spoke, was it yesterday's morning session, about roadmap and futures, and they were asking for lots of feedback. Contact Jeff Potts or whoever you can. Come and talk to me as well if you're interested. Other things, a few little subtleties I mentioned around, a little effectively UI convenience in terms of the delegated administration, where you could upload the IDP certificate to save you typing in a couple of URLs and uploading a certificate directly. You can do it in one step. We could do that. That is not really probably high on the priority list, but it could be done just for convenience. There's other things around disabling non-SAML logins. We could, I'll come to that in a second, but also we could potentially extract a few more attributes around first name, last name, other profile information. A big area is identity management or user lifecycle management. It's also, you'll probably find a JIRA for it in terms of the public API to Alfresco. SAML doesn't solve that problem. Unfortunately, that isn't part of the SAML spec. There were, I think, there's a thing called, there's a kind of a possible standard that's progressing through IETF organization. It's called SCIM. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but I think it's something like Simple Cloud Identity Management. There's 1.1, and they're looking at version 2, but I'm not yet sure about the uptake. If you're interested in that, come and talk to us. But in any case, there's been some discussions around how you might manage user identities, as an example, through our public APIs. That's not really, kind of out of scope for this talk, but I realize it's an important area that people would be interested in. Another area is mobile and desktop applications, potentially. There is a way of doing this, and it's something we probably need to talk about and find feedback in terms of, in most cases, what could be done is most applications, native mobile or desktop, probably have the ability to pop up an embedded browser. And if so, it is theoretically or it is practically possible to combine the SAML flows. I think there was a talk maybe just before this session, next door, I think, around OAuth. I didn't go to it, but that has its own flows. But those flows can be combined. It may look complicated on a diagram, but in terms from a user experience, it can be relatively straightforward. And there's possibilities of combining those flows to enable direct access on a native mobile application. I've put the caveat there, speculative, non-exhaustive list. There's probably other things that people want to maybe come and talk to me about or discuss with product management. Quick recap. SAML is a mature open OASIS standard. We've talked about configuring a circle of trust or a trust relationship between at least one service provider and identity provider, potentially multiple service providers if you're using multiple applications, maybe you're using a portal. I gave the example of Centrify, and I say Zazie gave an example of screenshot using Ping. That configuration is done by exchanging metadata, either formally using the SAML standard or out of band. But effectively, you configure both sides. You'd have a network administrator or a system administrator. If you're in an organization, if you've got your own corporate directory, they're probably the same person. Doesn't necessarily have to be, but you exchange that configuration data, and it's relatively trivial in Alfresco Share or in the admin screen to add in, set up that configuration. So you set it up on both sides. I think one of the things I skipped earlier in terms of features, one of the things we have done for our Alfresco 4.2 we've just released is we have a repo admin tool. And that is something that we would have to potentially, if we were going to do enterprise SAML, I think the share admin tool would be perfectly convenient to do it there. But obviously for completeness, you could imagine ultimately in the future you might have the option to do it through the repository admin tool as well. So at the moment it's fairly trivial to, or fairly straightforward to set up that exchange of metadata, so you have that trusted relationship using PKI. OpenSAML is a low-level library that allows you to implement those message exchanges and effectively implement what's called in SAML speak the web browser profile, but implement single sign-on, single logout. It's available now for enterprise customers who use the cloud. There are the references that you can look up later if you're interested. I put this diagram in here. I think this is an article from ZDNet where nowadays it says basically its title is something like everybody knows that you're a dog, because nowadays with all the other ways of collaborating on the internet in terms of Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and everything else, so nowadays you can't hide. But thank you very much. I don't know if there's any questions. I've got a couple of minutes. I don't want to keep you from lunch, and obviously you can find me afterwards if you don't want to ask in public, but I don't know if there's one.
John Eibel from Alfresco Product Management. While we've got everyone in the room, I'd just like to go back over what Jan was saying about the demand for SAML on Alfresco on-premise. So I wonder if we just have a quick show of hands. Who here has a business need for deploying SAML with Alfresco on-premise? Wow, okay.
Yeah.
And just is that a current business need or a future, something you're looking at doing yourself? So who has a current business need, something there? Yeah, same thing. Okay, brilliant, thanks very much. Thank you.
And are there any other questions or comments at this stage? Well, thanks very much for your time.